Welcome everyone to this data design deep dive webinar or training workshop, whatever we want to call this. So today we are going to dig a little bit deeper into the Avo product, and I'm also going to give you some recommendations and best practices. So today, the first thing we're going to do is to talk, or I'll tell you a little bit about who I am. And then we will do a brief workflow refresher. So in case you didn't attend the Avo Basic webinar, which was either earlier today or 2 weeks ago, then I will do a little refresher on that. Then go into recommendations and best practices, and this is both related to Avo and also just in general our recommendations and best practices and what we have gathered through our experience working with analytics and tracking plans. Then we will spend most of the time in this part here, designing good data in Avo. So here I'm going to go through different aspects of the Avo workspace, and we're going to dig a little bit deeper into the different configurations that you can do and basically go into everything that can make Avo more powerful for you. Then we'll talk a little bit about upcoming training sessions. So who am I? So my name is Thora. I've been at Avo for a few years now, almost 3. As an early employee, I've had a few different hats, and my background is in product analytics. So I have basically lived and breathed product analytics since the year 2014. So I'm very familiar with the space, the problems in that space, and the challenges. And yeah, so that is my background. Now I'm focusing on the customer success at Avo. So my main goal is to help our customers and the people that are thinking about becoming customers or evaluating if Avo is a fit, to see value in Avo and to get value from Avo. So that's briefly about me. So to start with, like I mentioned, I wanted to do a brief workflow refresher. And you might be familiar with this circle here. So these are 6 steps, the step 0 and up to step 5. And the pink steps here, they happen in Avo. So usually when teams are working on new products, they want, or new features, or making some iterations on the product, they want to be able to measure success. So what happens is that some product changes are decided and they are documented in some project management tool, probably one of these, Jira, Asana, maybe Slack if it's a little bit one-off, or anything else, maybe in GitHub or GitLab or whatever. And then what happens is someone, often a product person, takes this product definition that happens in one of these tools and translates them into, or like not translates them, but decides success metrics and event structures to be able to construct those success metrics. And this happens in Avo, and there is a branched workflow that you can use so that you can suggest changes in isolation from the source of truth, which lives on the main branch. And then you want to get feedback. So I'm a product person. I probably want to get feedback from an engineer. I want to get feedback from a data person. And this conversation happens in context of the changes in Avo, and they are stored in context of the item that is being discussed forever. So it's a reference point for anyone that is coming in to the tracking plan later on. Then you request implementation, and you can either do that through Avo. So you request implementation, and the implementation itself happens with Avo functions, or you can just share developer instructions with a developer. And you can share those into whatever project management tool that you're using or in Slack. And they can use those implementation instructions to either implement using Avo functions or implement using the direct calls to your analytics tool. So there is a way to only use Avo to manage your tracking plan and use all of the things that we're going to be talking about today to manage your tracking plan without using any of the developer tools. If you are using the Avo developer tools, then what happens next when everyone has aligned on the tracking changes and the branch has been accepted and or approved, then a developer comes in, pulls the code based on the changes made in Avo and implements using the type-safe Avo functions that are provided in the generated code. And then there is some validation or verification that happens. So you can, if you're using Avo functions, or actually if you're not using Avo functions, but if you have Avo functions or inspector, then you have access to this debugger here. There's also another, like other developer tools that help you verify the implementation. And then there's also the inspector that is ingestion time. So the debugger and other developer tools are in development time, but this is in ingestion time. So it gives you an overview of all the events and all the issues associated with the events, both on your development environment, staging, and production environment. You can also get alerting on these issues. And then what happens next is that the data is analyzed in your analytics tool. So this is just a brief refresher on the workflow. And we're not going to go into details of this workflow like I did in the Avo Basics webinar, if you attended that one. But what we're going to do is to go into more like configurations of each of the things that you can suggest changes in Avo. Yeah, I also want to mention, please don't hesitate to drop in any questions. So there's like a Q&A section in Zoom that you can drop questions in. Please feel free to do that at any time when you think of questions, and I will answer them at the relevant time. So even though if it's not relevant to what I'm talking about right now, I will try to fit them in accordingly. Okay. So the next thing that I wanted to talk about, I wanted just to briefly talk about our recommendations and best practices, because we get a lot of questions about this. We have seen so many tracking plans, and we have worked on so many tracking plans, both in previous lives, in previous companies, and also with our customers. So, you know, I just wanted to share some of them with you. And the first thing that I wanted to talk about is naming conventions. So I will help you to adhere to your naming conventions in some way, but in some way you have to kind of enforce them yourselves. So for naming conventions and for events specifically, there are these 4 aspects that we usually look at. First one is the structure. So there is usually an object and an action that is constructing an event, and we recommend choosing the same order of the object and action for all your events. So either have the object action. So for example, sign up completed, that will be object action, and action object, that will be the reverse. So completed sign up. I prefer the object action structure purely because it orders very nicely. So it orders by the object instead of the action. And then similar and related events are ordered together, both in Avo and also in my analytics tool. So that's just my personal preference. But whatever you choose, you know, just stick with it. Then there's the casing. There are many different casings out there, and these are just examples of a few of them. Just, you know, the important thing is to pick one and be consistent with it. You can have one casing for your events and another casing for your properties, but in the end, this is all string, so it doesn't matter. I would recommend picking something that is human readable. So I like, for example, title case, because it's just really human readable, as opposed to camel case, which is a little bit less human readable, in my opinion. Then the tense. So this is a little bit tricky because it can be really easy to diverge from the tense. You have sign up complete, and then you have sign up completed. Then you have two different events for the same user action, and then you have to always add those two events in the future when you're going to analyze that data. And that, of course, applies to everything. Then for the language, I really recommend that you use your company's language for the objects. So try to use the words that are used, between your colleagues, instead of trying to, find something really fancy. Just use the words that everyone is familiar with and is used to using day to day. And then also for the action part, use consistent word for actions. So, when you are looking at the start and end of user journeys, for example, so always stick with, completed instead of end or successful. So just, pick the one and use that across all your events. That's what I recommend. Also for example, configuration events, you can configure a profile, you can configure a workspace or something like that. Then try to use the same words for those. So if you are successful in sticking to the same naming convention, then you are going to have a good time and few discrepancies between platforms, products, platform products, and code paths. These are the main three things where you can have discrepancies. And if you have discrepancies, it's going to be messing with your data. And also, if you have like a clear naming convention, it's going to be so much easier to navigate. You know which objects to look for. You know which actions to look for. You can scroll through the events list and look for the event that you're looking for. Then for properties, it's just the same. The reason why it's good to have a naming convention for properties is so you're not, creating duplicate events, or you are going to be hard for you to look for certain properties. So I recommend sticking to the same casing as well here, and also use the for the language, use the objects from your event name. So if you are using, for example, product a lot, don't use item in the properties. So try to use product in that same, when you're describing the same things. Then also try to have consistencies for properties that describe, for example, counts. So there are many ways to create a property that describes counts. There's like a number of items, num items, item count, total items. Try to stick with the same convention. So have always number of, or always something count. And same for example, configuration. Try to always stick within the same words, because it's going to be so much easier to navigate and decreases the risk of duplicates. That's naming conventions. If you have any questions about naming conventions, please feel free to drop in the Q&A section. Then I wanted to just lightly touch on some event-specific recommendations. For events, I think it's really important to have informative descriptions describing what the event means beyond what the event name is. And I really recommend having in the description something that says about when the event is sent. Also, other information that is necessary for newcomers to understand or to implement the event, but at least exactly when the event should be sent, not approximately, because then you're going to have discrepancies again. Discrepancies is something that you really, really don't want when you're working with data. Also, what I do recommend here is having events that are used to construct metrics. So we discussed this a little bit in the AVA Basics webinar, because this is the reason why we are pushing our customers towards using metrics to help them design their data. So you use metrics to define, these are the questions that I have, these are the metrics that we're going to measure. And then you use those, kind of the metrics feature in AVA to be able to decide, I need these events to answer these questions, instead of just tracking everything, because then you have so much noise in your data and you have a hard time finding things. Then rather ask the question first and then construct or create some events. I have a question here. Do you recommend having the same convention for both events and properties? So this is a great question. I prefer having, for example, the same casing for events and properties. I also, like I mentioned here, prefer using the same objects between these between events and properties. So like I would recommend having it as consistent as possible, because that's going to reduce the risk of someone deviating from the naming convention. Of course, there are some cases that it's just not possible. For example, there are some analytics platforms that only allow properties in snake case. So then I would rather recommend using title case for the event names and then snake case for the property names. I forgot to press the answer live button. I was answering this question live. I hope this answered your question. Yes, normally, but sometimes there are, of course, exceptions. Okay, I talked about informative descriptions and are used to construct metrics. Then I also wanted to talk about events that describe user actions. So when you have had some experience in creating tracking plans and defining events, you try different things and you figure out what works. But throughout my time in creating tracking plans and working with people, I have found that events that describe user actions scale much better than events that, for example, just describe button clicks. And also, they are just more accessible and understandable for user journeys. So button clicks, if you have sign up button click, what if you change it to change the copy of the button? Or you have, read more sign up, no, read more CTA. What if you change it to learn more or something like that? Then if you have a event that is specific to a CTA or specific to a button, then that doesn't scale very well. And it doesn't really describe the user action, because the user wasn't clicking a button. The user, they were trying to do something. They were completing their sign up. They were starting their sign up. They were, whatever it is. So that's my recommendations, to have your event names such that they describe the user actions instead of being something just that they interact with. Again, really related to the earlier point, names that scale with your product. So I've talked about shallow and fat events. So this maybe doesn't make sense to anyone, but I will try to explain it. So shallow events are, for example, events that are don't have a lot of properties. So there is like a unique event for almost every user action. The polar opposite would be fat events, which have a lot of properties, and there is like a umbrella event for a lot of different interactions. For example, there is like configured events. So if you are configuring your profile, you might be changing your profile picture, you might be changing your username or something. Many would be tempted to have a distinct event for all of these different configurations that we can do to your profile. What I prefer is to have like a profile configured event with then a property that says what you are interacting with and what you are changing. And this allows you to see, like, if you are looking at the profile configured event, what are the most, you can segment by what are the most items that are configured in your profile. Instead of having to collect all of these username change, birthday change, profile picture change events to be able to look at that. And that also allows you to not have a really long list of events. That's bad because both some analytics tools just allow an X number of events, distinct events, to be tracked in their analytics tools. And then also, when you have so many distinct events, you have a long list of events, and then it becomes a little bit harder to understand, like, what events should I be using, what represent what. So we recommend finding a balance between shallow and fat events. Sometimes it's good to have shallow events, especially for significant user actions. Then you want to have, a dedicated event for that. But for less significant user actions, for example, configuring a profile, it's not really important, but you still want to know, then you can just have a consolidated event for them. Then journeys, they have a beginning, middle, and an end. So this is something that I always recommend. So significant user actions, for example, a checkout, onboarding, sign up, journeys like that, they have a start and an end. So if you have designed a checkout completed event, then you might want to consider having a checkout started event. What part of the user journey is the start of the checkout? Then also there are some, there's a middle in this journey. And sometimes some of those steps are less significant. So maybe they don't need an event unless you're going to be digging deeper later. In the beginning, they don't maybe need an event, or they can have like a consolidated event. So for example, here I say sign up started. That's the start of the user journey. And then we could have a sign up step with properties that indicate which step the user was completing, and then you have sign up completed. Please feel free to ask any questions. Or, if you have any, if you don't agree with something, please feel free to do that as well. Pop that into the Q&A section. Then we have property-specific recommendations. I'm going to try to go a little bit fast through this so we can dig deeper into the product. So the same as with events, I really recommend using informative descriptions for properties as well. This is super useful for people that are discovering a tracking plan or going to implement the property. Then try to keep consistency and definition between product platforms, events, and code paths for properties. So I write here, keep the meaning, type, presence, and constraints as consistent as possible, and create separate properties when not. So we highly recommend against using like super generic property names, for example, name or source, because there are different things that have names in your product. There are different source meanings. So I would really recommend having like a product name property, page name property, button name property, because these three things, they have all a different meaning. They could also have different presence, which means if the property is required or optional, and even different constraints. Same with events, try to use properties that scale with your product. The best example of this, a property that does not scale, is Boolean properties. Because if you're using Boolean properties, that suggests that there are only two options. So maybe you start with two options. So for example, if you have two ways to log into your product, it's email and Facebook, then a lot of people will be tempted to have a property called used Facebook, which is true if you log in with Facebook and false if you log in with email. But instead, it would scale much better if you add more authentication methods. To have an authentication method property, which has values for Facebook and email, and then you can add later Google, GitHub, Twitter, whatever authentication methods that you add later. Instead of you having to have a used Facebook property and then also a used Google property, and then you end up with 5 different Boolean properties when you could have had one. Defined groups of properties. This is also really handy, and this is something that I will show you in Avo later, how you can define a group of properties, because it's so easy to forget a property when there is like a a set of properties that go together often on events. Then we recommend defining a group of properties. Then my last recommendation today is to update a user property at the same time as an event is sent. So usually when we are updating a user property, there is a significant user action happening. So for example, when an email user property is updated, it's pretty significant because first time it's updated, it's when the person signs up. And then again later if they change their emails. I would say that these two are pretty significant user actions. So Avo actually provides a way to add a user property or have a user property being updated at the same time as an event is sent. All right, we're halfway through our time, which is exactly what I had imagined. So the next thing on the agenda is designing good data in Avo. So now I'm actually going to stop in full screen because I'm going to be jumping between these slides and the Avo product because we're going to be doing all of this there. And I would recommend that you follow along in your workspace. So most of you should have an Avo account. So I recommend that you open your workspace and create a branch, and then you can play around and do whatever I'm showing you. So I will also walk you through that. So the first thing that we're going to talk about and like dig into, deep dive in Avo, is the workspace configuration. So there are a few things that you can configure for your workspace. Then we're going to be talking about importing and publishing. Then we're going to talk about how to configure sources and destination, and specifically for data design purposes. Then creating and configuring categories, configuring metrics, configuring events, configuring properties. And then we're talking about the inspector last, how to read the inspector. All right, so workspace configuration. So what we're going to talk about here is how to force approval for branches. So we have this approval workflow that you can have like an opt-in that you can just use if you feel like it, or you can force it for your workspace. Then we're going to look at configuring login methods and configuring roles. So let's dig into it. So this is my demo track plan, and to configure my workspace, I go into this little settings wheel and into members and permissions. So now I'm thinking maybe only admins have access to this. So not all of you might be able to walk through this with me. But first thing that I wanted to show you is how to force the approval workflow. So this checkmark here, protected main branch, means that only admins can make changes directly to the main branch, and branches require an approval to be merged. So there's at least one person from your tracking plan that needs to click the approve button to be able to merge the branch, unless you're an admin. So you can just check this on here, and then your main branch is protected. Then there is the authentication method here. So here, this is currently now just visibility. So if you want, have interest in either Google SSO or SAML SSO, then you can contact us and we can hook you up with the authentication method that you want to use. So Google SSO means that everyone is just required to sign up and log in with Google, so they cannot log in just with their email. And SAML is that SAML provider that can be connected to our workspace. Then there is the members here. So admins are the only ones that can configure the member permissions. So for example, here I can change Alex's permissions from editor to admin, or comment only, or view only. So view only, that means that you only have access to your tracking plan to view. You cannot change anything, or you cannot communicate at all. Comment only means that you have the same as view access, but you're able to comment on branches and events and properties. Editor means that you are able to make changes to the tracking plan. You are able to generate code, and you basically can do everything except some member things, building, and these permissions, I think. Okay, this thing here. How to force approval of branches, configuring locking methods, and configuring roles. Okay, cool. Then importing and publishing. So I take this together because these things are super related. So here I'm going to talk about how to import your tracking plan into Avo, whether you have a clean slate and in Avo, so you don't have any events there yet, or if you only have a subset of your events in Avo and want to import the rest. Then how to set up a publishing integration, how to publish, and where you can export and publish from, and export and publish to. So let's take a look at this. So the first thing that I wanted to show you is the import. I'm going to create a new branch for this. No, so new branch, import. All right. So now I'm in a new branch, so now I'm not breaking anything for our demo tracking plan. So here I can go into the wheel and click the import button. And that brings me here. So here I can select a CSV file to import. And here you can see the documentation of how to import or export first from Amplitude and import it into Avo, export from Mixpanel and import it into Avo, and then what Google Sheet format we support. So I'm going to just drop my CSV here. So here's a CSV with some events. So these are just some events from my actually from this thing here. Oh, what happened here? Here. So the events that I'm importing now are these events here from the Avo Analytics Tracking Plan template, and you can use this as a template even if you would like and are not using Avo. Okay. So I'll do this again, import, and then I can pick. I don't want my sign up started and sign up completed events. I don't want the game count property, and then I can pick which branch I want it on. I already added this import Thora branch here, and then it selects that by default, but I can select another branch. Then I just click import. Boom, 7 events imported successfully, 5 properties and 1 source. So then I just get started. So here I can see then what got imported to my tracking plan. And this can be useful for teams that have added some events to the tracking plan and just a subset, and are kind of step by step adding more events to the track plan, because it can be a little bit difficult to import everything at the same time and trying to clean all of that up. So some teams choose to do it step by step. So that's how you could do it. And then what you can do also, because now I have all these new events here, I can then publish them to either Amplitude Govern, Mixed Panel Lexicon, Segment Protocols, or my webhook. So if you take Amplitude Govern as an example, I have already set this up here. I have added my Amplitude API key and my secret key, and the documentation walks you through what you need and how you can get this from the analytics tools. And then I can define what events I want to publish. So for example, I can only select events that are sent to Amplitude. That kind of makes sense to only send those events, because I don't want all the other events. Or I can only include events with tags, for example. And then I can also select if I want this integration to be published automatically when a branch is merged. And this is really useful, because then wait. Can you hear me still? It looks like my camera is frozen. Well, let's try to. Okay, can hear you. Thank you. Just had to turn it on, off and on again. Okay. So yeah, so this is really useful to keep your descriptions for your events and properties and categories in Amplitude in sync with the main branch. So basically, what Avo does is to publish the tracking plan, like you have defined in Avo, with the descriptions and the categories into Amplitude Govern. And if you have this checkmark here on, then this is automatically published whenever a branch is merged, which means it's always in sync with your main branch. Okay, what else was I going to talk about? Set up a publishing integration, how to publish, where you can export from and publish to. Yeah, so I can also just manually hit the publish button here. So this should be a working integration, and we should see this work. It takes a little bit. No, something went wrong. Maybe my my integration is not correctly set up. I think it should be set up correctly. Oh well, that is a problem with my integration, not with. Oh, okay, it worked the second time. Okay, cool. Yeah, so now I have published my tracking plan into Amplitude Govern, and if I'm using Amplitude Govern to decide which events are accepted into Amplitude, then Avo is actually, or like these events are automatically marked as allowed in Amplitude, which is super useful. Okay, I think on to the next one. Configuring sources and destinations. Here I have put a little circle around what exactly I'm going to be talking about. And here I also have some useful docs and blog posts. So I will share these, the stack with you afterwards, and so you can use it as a reference. If you remember something that you wanted to look into further, then you can dig into the docs or blog posts that I link to here. So sources and destinations, you can find them in connections here. Wait, I was going to be on my branch here. So these are my connections. So these are my sources or development platforms and programming languages. And here are my analytics tools. So I'm just going to show you some useful things for data design here. So here is my web source, for example, and here I can configure which destinations should be sending events to. So if I don't want to send my events from web to intercom, then I can just uncheck that here. Then, because it's not really easy to bulk add sources to events from the events view, there is a way to do that here from the source view. So here I can see all the events in my tracking plan, and those that are sent from this web source, they are checked. So if I just want to include all of them, then I can just check this, or I can uncheck, you know, whatever I don't want to be sent from web, and then confirm that. So this is useful for, you know, bulk doing things, especially if you import your tracking plan without any sources. Then this is super useful because adding it to every single event from the events view is a little bit tedious. Then you can also edit from here, from the source, which events should be implemented with AVO and which should not. So here are only the events that are sent from web. So only those that are checked here. And here you can see which are supposed to be implemented with AVO. So this checkmark means when a developer generates code, will this event be included in the generated code? So this checkmark here is really useful for teams that are adopting AVO, when usually first they don't implement any events with AVO, maybe are just using AVO to manage their tracking plan, but then like slowly they start to use AVO functions, and then you check these this implemented with AVO check mark, and then you generate code based on that. Yes, that was all about sources, I think. I'm always checking on questions. Please feel free to ask away. Also, I wanted to show you some tricks with destinations. Here, the same here, you can decide which sources should be connected to this destination. But very useful here is this include by default checkmark here. So if you have multiple destinations and you maybe have one for product analytics, you maybe have one for marketing, you might not want to have all events sent by default to the marketing platform, because usually there are just like a subset of events that you need there. Then you might want to have this off. So how it will look on the event. So if I just go in here you can see that these are on by default: custom analytics API, amplitude, and Mixpanel, and Braze and Facebook Analytics, they are off by default. Yep. Let me see if I remembered everything. Which source and destination should be connected? What events are sent from the source? Implemented AVO or not in this source? Include destination by default or not? I got a question. Are there any plans to include further destinations? For example, Google Analytics. So, we do support most destinations with what we call custom destinations. You can see that in the docs in here, setting up custom destinations. So we have kind of moved a little bit away from supporting every single destination, because most teams that are using AVO, they already have some tracking and already are sending some events to their destinations, which means they already have the SDK installed in their application and are managing that themselves. If we would kind of natively support the destination, then AVO is managing the SDK for you. So if you already have some events, we already and always recommend that you set up a custom destination anyways. So that does not mean that we are not going to support anything else natively, but Avo does support Google Analytics just with a custom destination, and it supports, you know, most destinations or all destinations that have this event call, which includes an event name and a dictionary of properties. So yeah, that should be supported. Okay, there's another question. So if we wanted to add a new destination, we could just use this custom analytics API destinations to perhaps iterable or Markero. Yes. So then what you would do is to do here add destination and just pick the custom one and create. And you can name it iterable, for example. And the analytics tool is custom. You don't need product API keys for that. And then what you do is follow the explanation here in the doc, setting up custom destination on how to proceed and how to configure it in code. It's a really easy one-off setup that you need to do for that. I answered this question and this question. You're welcome. Okay. So iterable here, include by default around. Okay, let's continue. We have 12 minutes left. Hopefully we can go through all of this. So creating and configuring categories. I'm going to go through this fast. So you can see here that this tracking plan is categorized by categories. And to add a category, let's add a login category or something. You just do that here. And then you can add a description to the category. And you can add metrics to the category. And you can add there's my login category. Login. I clicked something weird. And then I can add events to my category. So I actually sometimes use this. I actually have it here. Use the categories to document what we call purpose meetings. So I mentioned before that we recommend deciding the questions and metrics first before you start looking into events. And we sometimes use the description field for the category to document the meeting that we have about defining the goals for the product update, the problems with the problem, which is the reason why we're doing the product update, and things like that. And then we also document the metrics and events in context. So that is really useful and is like a good documentation for future references. And then you can also use this category view here, or you can, if you prefer, just order it alphabetically, you can do that view here. Okay, configuring metrics. So I wanted to dig a little bit into the metric types. So these are some metric types that you might be familiar with from Amplitude or Mixpanel, and these are really common ones there. So funnels, they are really useful for documenting the user journey, so the significant user actions in the journey. And this is usually what I do first. So when I'm designing data for a new flow, then I think about, okay, this is the flow. These 4 events are significant events in the user journey. So it helps me identify those events. Then segmentation, this is really useful to identify properties that you want to segment on. So for example, if we had a cart update event and I want to segment by the product categories that of the items that are added to the cart, for example. So this is helpful for understanding, okay, which properties do I need to be able to segment or filter on. Then retention, that's another metric that is often used. And there you can define a born event and a return event. It's just a pretty simple setup here. And then proportion, this is also something that I really like to use. So you divide one event with another event. You can read further about this in defining a metric. This is from our docs. I recommend looking into that if you want to learn more. Then configuring events. Now we're getting to the juicy part. So there are a bunch of configurations that you can make per event, and I'm going to walk you through those. So there's like the source and destination configuration that can be done per event. So it's specific for that event. Then adding and configuring actions, adding user properties and system properties, name mapping, categories, and tags. So let's pick an event. So let's pick this checkout complete event, which I defined in the workshop this morning. So I haven't configured it at all, except adding this source. So if I wanted to configure this source for this event specifically, so which destinations to send to, then I can do that here. So I don't want to send this event to Mixpanel, but I do want to send it to Breaks. So here I'm configuring it just for this event. Yeah, just for this event. Same here with implement with Avo. So I can click this check mark, and then I'm indicating whether this event, it should be generated code from. Yes, then about actions. So this is something that we get a lot of questions about. So actions are these things here. Let's go a little bit further up. These things here. So one action, and that is included by default, is the log event. So this is just like the most basic thing that you can do. You just log an event, it has a name, and it has some event properties. And then there are other ones, other actions. For example, update user properties, identify user. Is my trackpad out of battery? It seems like it. Okay. Update user properties, identify user, unidentify user, log revenue, and log page view. So it kind of depends on the analytics tool that you're using, whether these are supported or not. But most, at least, support update user properties, identify user, and unidentify users. Some of them support log revenue, and only segment supports log page view. So let's add the update user properties action to this event. So I want to update a user property when a checkout is complete. So an example here could be number of transactions. So now I'm creating a user property for number of transactions. Let's take the suggestion of the naming convention here. Creating that user property here. So this user property is defining how many transactions this user has made during their lifetime. So I want to keep this as an integer. And the minimum is 1 or 0 probably. Let's keep it as 0. And there's no maximum. So now I've added a constraint. Sneak peek into what comes next. So here we have added a user property that is going to be updated when the checkout is completed. Then I might also want to add the user property to another event. So it's maybe also updated when we have a session start, just to make sure, check how many transactions that they've made. Then I just add update user properties here and add number of transactions here. and then that's add. Okay, let's look at, well, let's just continue here. Then, for example, the log revenue one. So this does different things depending on your destination. So for example, if you have amplitude here, then these are some default properties that amplitude adds. And this one is for Mixpanel, and these one are for Facebook Analytics. So what you get here is that you log revenue to your analytics platform, and then your analytics platform does usually some magic with that to calculate LTV and stuff like that. So you can also see that the log revenue did not come on top, it comes last. So this actually, the order of the actions, it indicates in which order they happen. So first on this event, the session start event, update user properties happens first. So the user properties are updated before the event is sent, and then the revenue is logged. Okay. Then you can see here which metrics this event is related to. And this is really useful for documentation and for just awareness. What happens, like what will be affected when I change this event? This event is a part of my checkout funnel, which is a really important funnel for us. So I might want to be careful or talk to the right people when I change it. Then you can also have add categories, or you also have visibility into which categories are included in this event. And then you can add tags. So for example, this event has been tagged with core experience team. So here are tags used as ownership. This could also be, for example, countries. I've seen some teams use tags like that, or whatever is helpful for you to organize your data. Let me see, name mapping and system properties. That's what I haven't done. So name mapping is especially helpful when you have multiple destinations. Where did the name mapping go? Here, multiple destinations, and you need to send the event or property as something specific for that destination. So for example, let's say that some destination needs session start typed like this. Let's say Mixpanel. So now this event is going to be sent like this in capital letters to all destinations except Mixpanel. It will be sent with lowercase snake case. Oh no, we're almost out of time. I'm going to finish this. I hope some of you have time to be with me to the end. If not, the recording will be put up on our website on avo.app.training, /training. But I have left configuring properties and the inspector, and I will finish that. Someone has their hand up. You want to talk? Okay, just comment something if you have a question. Okay, configuring properties. So I'm going to talk about the different value types. The property presence configuration, this always sent here. Constraints, name mapping, and creating a property group. So let's go into the properties view. So here is a view of all the properties that have been defined in my tracking plan. And here you can see the groups of properties that have been defined. So to create a new group, you just click here, add group, and then you will be able to create a new property group. So an example of a property group is this product info here, and it contains all the product information that go together on events that require product info. So you never forget to include the product ID, for example. Then let's look at the product type property. So here are all the the property types that you can select. So any is one. That means that every type of property is accepted in the validation that the AVO functions provide. So there's no validation of the property type. We really recommend against using this property type. So use the other ones as much as you can. String, that means that there is a string and you can actually define which strings are allowed for this property. So let's say we are selling some clothes. So we are selling socks, we are selling pants, and we're selling sweaters. So now I've put constraints on the string property such that a property value, it should match one of these values. And nothing else, if you're using the AVO functions, nothing else will be accepted by the validation from the AVO functions. Then we have integers, then it's just a number, and you can also add rules to that. You can add a minimum and a maximum. So you can have, like, if you have between 0 and 1, then you have like the AVO function will not accept anything below or beyond that. Same thing with the floating numbers. You can add minimum and maximum to that as well. Then we have Boolean, that's simply true or false. So there are no constraints that you can apply to that. And then there is the object one. So the constraints that you can add to that is actually another property. So let's say we have, this is a product property here. And this product object should include product ID, product name, and product price. So here I'm deciding which property keys are allowed, and then each property key has can have a rule in itself. Okay, product here. So that's the last one. So both the any type and the object type, they are not available by default. They are available upon request, because a lot of these analytics tools that AVO supports, they don't support objects very well. If you are using a string property and you have the property values defined, sweater and pants, then you can both, or like for all properties, you can configure the presence per source, and you can also configure the property constraints per source. So for example, if iOS never sends this property product on the cart update event, and web does, then you can set it as never on iOS and always on web. And if web only sells socks and iOS only sells pants, then you can configure that here. So here's some flexibility in configuration per source, which can be really useful for teams that have, for example, different products, or there's some variability between their sources. Let me see, name mapping, that's the only thing that I have left. So let's go here. The same with the properties as is with the events. You can map the name for specific destinations. So for example, if the product property should be item for amplitude, then you can define that like that. Okay, that was my last for properties. Then I was going to look into inspector. How does it work? How to read the dashboard, how to set up Slack alerts, and what does the inspector alert on? Okay, so the inspector is in here. So here is the report. So here we can see a list of all the events that the inspector has seen, no matter if you are sending the events with owl functions, or if it's just existing tracking that you're using tracking calls, the native tracking calls for each destination. So what you can do is to add or install this inspector SDK to your product, and that and add some lines of code that allows you to listen to the existing tracking and get a state of your existing tracking into Avo. So here I can see all of the events that are being sent, either with Avo functions or without Avo functions. And here you can see this little bookmark here, and that means these events are defined in our tracking plan. So if it's not defined in our tracking plan, and there's an event that comes in, then, for example, you will get an alert. Same with properties. So these are all the events, and you can search for events if you have a lot of them. So we can, if I want to look at all the sign up events, then I can search for them and look at this view. And this view is persistent in the URL. So I can share this view, exactly this view, with someone else. And same if I wanted to look at the issues on the sign up complete event, this view is also persisted in the URL, so you can share that with anyone. Okay, so let's look at some issues. So here is, for example, an issue on a message sent. So here I can see when I click here, the general issues for all the platforms. Here we only have, in this example, workspace, only one platform, but if you had more, they would go here side by side. So for this message sent event, we can see that there are 3 different issues. 2 of them are related to a property that is sometimes missing. So this channel privacy type property is sometimes not provided. It's missing in 31% of event volume, and the same with channel type. And I can expand this to look at this specifically and see where the issues are coming from. If I had more sources, then I could see, in which platforms they are missing or where they are not missing. So this percentage here, it indicates that this property here, channel privacy type, it was on 69% of the 756 events that were seen by Avo. Then the other issue here is, for example, the channel privacy type. So it expects an integer according to the tracking plan, but it's sent as a string. So this is considered an issue because it has been defined as an integer, but it's been being seen as a string. So this inspector here is a tool for you to be able to identify any issues with your existing tracking, or to QA the tracking that you are implementing, either with Avo or without Avo. So this can be really powerful. And if you want to configure Slack alerts, then you simply click this button here. You go into manage sources and click connect to Slack, and you just follow the workflow that is happening there. Let me see how to set up Slack alerts. What is an inspector alert done? So let's look at that. Inspector. Wait a minute. Slip some Icelandic in there. So here are the things that inspector alerts on. So when a property is sometimes not provided, so this is alerted on either. So if your property is not in the tracking plan, then it will alert on if it's sometimes not provided. And also if it's marked as required in your tracking plan and it's not provided, then you get an alert as well. Property is sent with inconsistent type. So if there is something either defined as an integer and it's sent as a string, then you will get an alert. Or when the inspector sees two different types for a property, then you get an alert as well. New event seen that is not in the tracking plan. So this helps team enforce, when you are starting to use Avo to manage your tracking plan, it starts enforce people to use that workflow and define the events in Avo before implementing them and sending them into production. Then we have new property seen that is not in the tracking plan. That's the same as with events. So if there's an unexpected property that you don't want to, unexpected property, then you get an alert as well. And then property type does not match the tracking plan. That's like I told you here with inconsistent type. This is actually listed as a specific one. So so when it's defined as an integer and you see a string, for example. So you can look at the documentation in more detail here. Okay, so this is then what I wanted to cover today, 12 minutes over time. So sorry about that. I was hoping to be able to do this in an hour. It's a learning for the next session. But if you're interested in more of these sessions, then I recommend going into avo.app/training, which is going to have an overview over all the upcoming trainings right here. There's one tomorrow, implementation deep dive. If you're a developer, I highly recommend joining that because Alex, our developer advocate and developer, he will be leading that one. Highly recommend. So thank you all for attending. If you have any questions, please feel free to jump into the community Slack and message me directly there, or email me on my email, which is thora@avo.app, right here, thora@avo.app. Okay, thank you everyone, bye.